Picture this. It's the year 146 BC, the Mediterranean. Sun beats down mercilessly on the ancient city of Carthage. Smoke billows from burning buildings as Roman legions march through streets that once echoed with the voices of merchants from across the known world. For 17 days, the city burns. When the flames finally die, Rome's greatest rival is nothing but ash and memory. But this isn't just a story about conquest. This isn't merely a tale of armies and emperors. This is the story of how a small Italian city-state became the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, and how that same empire, seemingly invincible, eventually crumbled into dust from the mythical twins raised by wolves to the last emperor fleeing Constantinople. From gladiators dying for the entertainment of crowds, to philosophers shaping the minds of future generations, this is the complete story of Rome, an empire that lasted over 1,000 years. An empire whose influence still shapes our world today. But every empire has a beginning. And Rome's beginning, well, it starts with a crime that would echo through the centuries. The year is 753 BC, according to Roman tradition. On the banks of the Tiber River, two brothers stand on separate hills, each claiming divine right to found a new city. Their names are Romulus and Remus, and according to legend, they were abandoned as infants, saved by a she-wolf and raised by a shepherd. But legends often mask darker truths. When the brothers disagreed about where to build their city, Romulus didn't hesitate. He killed his own brother with his bare hands, then stood over the body and declared, "So perish anyone who dares leap over my walls." And so Rome was born in blood, a fitting beginning for an empire that would be built on conquest and maintained through violence. But let's step back from legend into history. The truth is, Rome didn't spring up overnight. The Italian peninsula in the 8th century BC was a patchwork of tribes and city-states. The Etruscans controlled much of central Italy with their sophisticated civilization. Greek colonies dotted the southern coasts. And in between, various Latin tribes scratched out a living in the hills and valleys. Rome was just one of many Latin settlements, built on 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. What made it special wasn't divine intervention, it was location. Rome sat at the first practical crossing point of the Tiber as you traveled inland from the sea. All roads, quite literally, led to Rome because Rome controlled the crossroads. In these early days, Rome was ruled by kings. 7 of them, according to tradition, each contributing something vital to the growing city. Numa Pompilius gave Rome its religious traditions. Servius Tullius built the first walls around all 7 hills. But it was the last king, Tarquin the Proud, whose tyranny would change Rome forever. Tarquin ruled with an iron fist. He eliminated rivals, ignored the Senate, and treated Roman citizens like subjects rather than partners in governance. But the final straw came when his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an unforgivable crime against Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman. Lucretia, rather than live with the shame, took her own life. But not before making her family swear an oath of vengeance. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, yes, an ancestor of the Brutus who would later assassinate Julius Caesar, the Roman nobles rose in rebellion. In 509 BC, they drove out Tarquin and his family. But more importantly, they made a vow that would define Roman politics for the next 5 centuries. Never again would Rome bow to a king. Instead, they created something new, a republic. From the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing. Power would be shared, checked, balanced. 2 consuls would rule together for 1 year only. A senate would provide wisdom and continuity. And the people, at least the male citizens, would have a voice. It was an experiment that had never been tried on such a scale. And for nearly 500 years, it would make Rome the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. But first, Rome had to survive. The early Roman Republic was like a newborn thrust into a world of predators. Surrounded by enemies, constantly under threat, Rome had 2 choices: Grow strong or die. The Romans chose to grow strong. Within decades of expelling their last king, Rome faced its first existential crisis. Lars Porsena, an Etruscan king, marched on Rome with a massive army, determined to restore Tarquin to the throne. The Romans found themselves besieged, cut off from supplies, facing starvation. This is where we first see the Roman character that would define their empire, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the state. When the Etruscans tried to cross the only bridge into Rome, a young officer named Horatius Cocles held them off single-handedly while his comrades destroyed the bridge behind him. As the structure collapsed, Horatius leaped into the raging Tiber in full armor and somehow swam to safety. True story or propaganda? It doesn't matter. What matters is that Romans believed it, and that belief shaped their identity. But Rome's greatest test came not from external enemies, but from within. The early republic was dominated by patricians, the old aristocratic families, who traced their lineage back to Rome's founding. Everyone else, the plebeians, were second-class citizens despite making up the vast majority of the population. In 494 BC, the plebeians had had enough. They didn't riot or rebel, they did something far more effective. They left, en masse. The entire working class of Rome simply walked out of the city and set up camp on a hill outside the walls. Imagine it, Rome without its farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, laborers. The patricians quickly realized they had no choice but to negotiate. The plebeians returned, but only after winning the right to elect their own representatives, tribunes, of the pleb who could veto any law that harmed plebeian interests. This conflict of the orders would continue for 2 centuries, but it gave Rome something unique, a system that could adapt and evolve without breaking. Other city-states were rigid, brittle. Rome was flexible, inclusive, at least by ancient standards. And Rome needed that flexibility because the wars were just beginning. The Aqui and Volsci harassed Roman territory from the mountains. The Veii, Rome's nearest Etruscan neighbors, controlled the salt trade that Rome desperately needed. For over a century, Roman armies marched out every spring to fight, returning every winter to tend their farms. The siege of Veii lasted 10 years, Rome's own Trojan War. When the city finally fell in 396 BC, Rome doubled its territory overnight. But victory came at a cost that nearly destroyed the Republic. Marcus Furius Camillus, the general who conquered Veii, was hailed as a second Romulus. The people loved him, the army worshipped him, and the Senate feared him. When Camillus celebrated his triumph, he painted his face red like the god Jupiter and rode through Rome in a golden chariot. The Romans had seen this before, a successful general becoming too powerful, too popular. It was how republics died and tyrannies were born. So they did what Romans always did when faced with a threat to their system. They destroyed the threat. Camillus was charged with corruption and driven into exile. The message was clear. No man, no matter how successful, was bigger than Rome. But Rome's enemies were watching. And in 390 BC, a Celtic war chief named Brennus led a massive Gallic army down from the north. At the Battle of the Allia, the Roman army simply disintegrated. Panic spread faster than wildfire. Within days, Gallic warriors were pouring through the streets of Rome itself. The city burned. The population fled. Only a small garrison held out on the Capitoline Hill, Rome's most sacred site. For months, the Gauls controlled the Eternal City, looting and destroying at will. Rome's darkest hour had arrived. But in that darkness, Roman character shone brightest. The Senate, rather than surrender, recalled Camillus from exile. The old general gathered the scattered Roman forces and struck back with devastating effectiveness. When Brennus finally agreed to leave Rome in exchange for a massive ransom in gold, Camillus arrived just as the Gauls were weighing the tribute. The Celtic chief had been using false weights to cheat the Romans. When the Romans protested, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales and declared, "Vi victus," Woe to the conquered. Camillus drew his own sword and replied, Romans are not ransomed with gold, but with iron. Then he attacked. The Gauls were driven from Rome, but the humiliation burned in Roman memory. Never again would Rome be so vulnerable. Never again would barbarians walk through Roman streets as conquerors. The Romans rebuilt their city with massive walls, the Servian Wall, parts of which still stand today. They reformed their army, creating the legendary manipular system that would dominate battlefields for centuries. And they began a systematic conquest of Italy that would take 200 years to complete. One by one, Rome's neighbors fell. The Aequi, the Volsci, the Hernici all were conquered or made allies. The great Etruscan cities submitted to Roman power. Even the fierce Samnites, masters of mountain warfare, were eventually defeated after 3 brutal wars that lasted nearly 50 years. By 264 BC, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River, but this wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. It was something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous to Rome's enemies. Rome didn't just defeat its enemies, it absorbed them. Conquered peoples became Roman allies, Roman citizens, Roman soldiers. The Roman army that would soon terrify the Mediterranean wasn't just Roman, it was Italian. Latins, Etruscans, Samnites, Greeks from the southern colonies, all fighting under Roman eagles, all sharing in Roman victories. Rome had created something the ancient world had never seen, a confederation that grew stronger with each conquest. But now, as Roman legions stood on the shores of the Mediterranean, they faced enemies who would test this system to its very limits. Across the narrow Strait of Sicily, another power was rising. A power that controlled the seas as completely as Rome controlled the land. A power that would force Rome to choose between remaining a regional Italian state or becoming a world empire. The Carthaginians were coming. Imagine 2 scorpions trapped in a bottle. That's what the Western Mediterranean had become by 264 BC. Rome dominated the land, Carthage ruled the seas. And both powers were expanding toward an inevitable collision. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Rome was a land-based republic of citizen soldiers, Carthage was a maritime empire built on trade and wealth. Where Romans fought for glory and conquest, Carthaginians fought for profit and commercial advantage. Where Rome absorbed its conquered enemies, Carthage simply exploited them. The spark that ignited the First Punic War was Sicily, that triangular island that sits like a football between Italy and North Africa. When the Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries, seized the city of Messana and asked for Roman protection, Rome faced a fateful choice. Helping the Mamertines meant war with Carthage. It meant building a navy from scratch to fight the greatest maritime power in the world. It meant abandoning the traditional Roman policy of staying on the Italian mainland. The Roman Senate debated for months, but the Roman people, assembled in their popular assemblies, made the decision that would change history. Rome would cross the water. The Romans had virtually no naval experience, but they had something more valuable: the ability to learn from their enemies. When a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast, Roman engineers took it apart plank by plank, studying every detailed dot. In just 60 days, Rome built a fleet of 100 warships. But the Romans knew they couldn't outmaneuver the experienced Carthaginian sailors. So they did what Romans always did. They found a way to turn a naval battle into a land battle. They invented the corvus, a massive boarding bridge with a spike on the end that could slam down onto an enemy ship's deck. Suddenly, Carthaginian naval superiority meant nothing. Roman legionaries could board enemy ships and fight the kind of close-quarters combat they excelled at. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the Roman fleet won its first major naval victory. The Carthaginians, who had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries, watched in shock as their ships were captured one by these upstart Italian farmers. But Rome's greatest victory in the First Punic War came not at sea, but on land. Marcus Atilius Regulus landed in North Africa with a Roman army and marched straight toward Carthage itself. For the first time in their history, the Carthaginians faced foreign soldiers on their home soil. Regulus won battle after battle, and Carthage sued for peace. But the Roman general's terms were so harsh that the Carthaginians decided they'd rather die fighting than accept them. They hired a Spartan general named Xanthippus, who taught them how to use their cavalry and elephants effectively against Roman infantry. At the Battle of Tunis, Regulus and most of his army were destroyed. The general himself was captured and spent the rest of his life in Carthaginian dungeons. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Rome had proven that Carthage could be beaten on its own territory. The First Punic War dragged on for 23 years. Rome lost entire fleets to storms over. 700 ships and 200,000 men drowned in the Mediterranean. But every time disaster struck, Rome simply built new fleets and recruited new armies. The Roman capacity for absorbing losses and continuing to fight amazed and terrified their enemies. Finally, in 241 BC, the Roman fleet won a decisive victory at the Aegates Islands. Carthage, bankrupt and exhausted, sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, and Carthage was forced to pay massive war reparations. But peace was just an intermission. Both sides knew the war wasn't really over. It was just postponed. In Carthage, a young general named Hamilcar Barca swore an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. He took his 9-year-old son to the altar of the god Moloch and made the boy swear the same oath. That boy's name was Hannibal, and he would become Rome's greatest nightmare. Hamilcar spent years building a new Carthaginian empire in Spain, training a new army and preparing for the war he knew must come. When he died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the work. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, 26-year-old Hannibal took command. In 218 BC, Hannibal did something that no Roman had thought possible. Instead of attacking by sea, where Rome now had naval superiority, he marched overland from Spain to Italy, through the Pyrenees, across southern Gaul, over the Alps in winter, with an army of 90,000 men, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The crossing was a nightmare. Avalanches, hostile tribes, freezing temperatures, and treacherous paths claimed more than half his army. But when Hannibal emerged from the Alps into the Po Valley, he had achieved the impossible. A Carthaginian army was loose in Italy. What followed was a masterclass in military genius. At the Trebia River, Hannibal lured the Romans into an ambush and destroyed an entire consular army. At Lake Trasimene, he caught another Roman army in a fog-shrouded valley and slaughtered 15,000 legionaries in 3 hours. Rome was in panic. For the first time since the Gallic sack, enemy soldiers were ravaging Italian soil. But the Romans did what they always did in crisis. They adapted. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, and he implemented a strategy that would bear his name for all time: Fabian tactics. Instead of meeting Hannibal in open battle, Fabius shadowed the Carthaginian army, attacking supply lines, cutting off foragers, avoiding major engagements. The Romans called Fabius the Delayer, and many thought he was a coward. But Fabius understood something crucial. Hannibal's army was magnificent, but it was isolated. Every casualty was irreplaceable. Every day in Italy without a decisive victory weakened Carthage's position, but the Roman people grew tired of Fabian tactics. They wanted a decisive battle, a glorious victory. In 216 BC, they elected 2 consuls who promised to crush Hannibal once and for all: Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius. VARRO. The Romans assembled the largest army in their history, 86,000 men, nearly twice the size of Hannibal's force. They marched south to the small town of Cannae, where Hannibal was waiting. What happened next was the most perfect tactical victory in military history. Hannibal arranged his army in a crescent formation. with his weakest troops in the center and his best soldiers on the flanks. As the Romans charged, the Carthaginian center gave way, drawing the legions deeper and deeper into the trap. Then Hannibal's flanks closed in like the jaws of a giant beast. The Romans found themselves completely surrounded, packed so tightly they couldn't even raise their weapons. For 8 hours the slaughter continued. When the sun set over Cannae, 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field. Among them was the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and the flower of Roman nobility. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history. In any other state, such a defeat would have meant surrender. Hannibal's officers begged him to march on Rome immediately. "In 5 days," they said, "you will dine on the Capitoline Hill." But Hannibal hesitated. And that hesitation gave Rome time to show the world what made it different from every other ancient state, the Roman. Senate met in emergency session. When someone suggested negotiating with Hannibal, the proposal was rejected without even a formal vote. Instead, they passed a decree that would echo through history. The Senate and people of Rome do not treat with enemies on Italian soil. Rome would not surrender. Rome would not negotiate. Rome would fight to the last man, the last coin, the last breath. They freed slaves to fill the legions. They melted down temple treasures to pay for new armies. They called up every ally in Italy, reminding them that their fates were tied to Rome's survival. And slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. Hannibal won battle after battle, but he couldn't win the war. His army grew smaller with each victory, while Rome seemed to multiply like the heads of the Hydra. For 13 years, Hannibal ravaged Italy. But he never took Rome. He never broke the Roman alliance system. And gradually, Roman strategy began to pay off. The Romans opened new fronts in Spain and Sicily, forcing Carthage to divide its resources. They recaptured rebellious cities one by one, often with terrible vengeance. When Capua, Rome's second largest city, defected to Hannibal, the Romans besieged it for 2 years and then sold the entire population into slavery. The turning point came when a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio landed in Spain and began systematically destroying Carthaginian power there. Scipio was different from other Roman commanders. He studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from them, improved upon them. In 204 BC, Scipio did to Carthage what Hannibal had done to Rome. He landed an army in North Africa and threatened the enemy's homeland. Carthage was forced to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the mother city. The two greatest generals of the age finally met at Zama in 202 BC. Hannibal, fighting on familiar ground with fresh troops, should have had every advantage. But Scipio had learned his lessons well. When Hannibal's war elephants charged, Scipio's men simply opened lanes in their formation, letting the beasts pass harmlessly through. When the Carthaginian cavalry tried to outflank the Romans, they found Scipio's allied horsemen waiting for them. For the first time in his career, Hannibal was outgeneraled. His army was destroyed, and Carthage sued for peace on Roman terms. The Second Punic War was over, but it had changed Rome forever. The republic that had started the war as a regional Italian power ended it as the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean. Roman armies had fought in Spain, Sicily, North Africa, and Greece. Roman fleets controlled the sea lanes. Roman diplomacy shaped the policies of kings and city-states across the known world. But some Romans weren't satisfied with mere dominance. They wanted total victory. Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, ended every speech in the Senate with the same words: Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't matter what the speech was about: taxes, public works, foreign policy. Cato always concluded with that ominous phrase. For 50 years, Rome and Carthage maintained an uneasy peace. But when Carthage finally fought back against Numidia, a Roman ally that had been raiding Carthaginian territory for decades, Rome declared it a violation of the peace treaty. In 149 BC, Roman legions landed in North Africa for the third and final time. The Carthaginians offered to surrender unconditionally, but the Romans demanded something unthinkable: the complete abandonment of their city. "Move inland," the Roman commanders said. "Build a new city at least 10 miles from the sea. Give up your harbors, your trade, your entire way of life." The Carthaginians chose to fight. For 3 years, Carthage endured one of the most brutal sieges in ancient history. The Romans built a wall around the entire city, cutting off all supplies by land and sea. Inside the walls, people ate leather, boiled grass, even resorted to cannibalism. In 146 BC, the walls were finally breached. For 6 days and nights, Roman soldiers fought through the streets, killing everyone they found. When the slaughter was over, the survivors' 50,000 men, women, and children were sold into slavery. Then the Romans burned the city. For 17 days, Carthage burned. When the flames finally died, Roman engineers plowed salt into the ruins and cursed the ground, so that nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, the city that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries, was gone. Erased from the earth as if it had never existed, Rome had won the ultimate victory. But in destroying Carthage, Rome had also destroyed something in itself. The Republic that had begun as a defensive alliance of Italian farmers had become a conquering empire that showed no mercy to its enemies. And empires, as Rome would learn, have different rules than republics, with Carthage reduced to ashes. Rome stood alone as the supreme power in the Mediterranean. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. Rome's very success created new challenges, new enemies, new temptations that would ultimately tear the Republic apart from within. The year 146 BC was a watershed in Roman history. On the same day that Carthage fell, Roman legions were destroying another ancient city, Corinth, the jewel of Greece. The message was unmistakable. Rome would tolerate no rivals, no matter how civilized, how ancient, how culturally superior they might be. But conquest brought problems that Roman institutions were never designed to handle. The Republic had been created to govern a city-state, not a world empire. Roman magistrates, elected for one-year terms, now commanded provinces larger than entire kingdoms. Roman armies, originally citizen militias that disbanded after each campaign, now served for years in distant lands, and the conquests continued, each victory making the next war inevitable. In Spain, Roman legions fought brutal guerrilla campaigns against Celtic and Iberian tribes. In Gaul, Roman merchants and settlers pushed northward, creating conflicts that demanded military intervention. In the East, the fragmenting kingdoms of Alexander's successors provided endless opportunities for Roman mediation. But the real transformation was happening at home. Rome was becoming rich fabulously, obscenely rich. Gold flowed in from Spanish mines. Slaves poured in from conquered territories. Tribute and taxes from the provinces filled the Roman treasury to overflowing. The city itself was changing beyond recognition. Magnificent temples rose on the Palatine Hill. Greek art filled Roman homes. Eastern luxuries became commonplace in Roman markets. The simple farmers who had defeated Hannibal were becoming cosmopolitan, citizens of a world empire. But not everyone benefited from Rome's success. The small farmers who formed the backbone of the Roman army returned from years of campaigning to find their fields ruined, their families scattered, their debts overwhelming. Meanwhile, wealthy Romans used slave labor to create vast plantations that could undersell any free farmer. The Roman countryside was emptying as displaced farmers flocked to the city, creating a vast urban underclass dependent on government handouts. The citizen soldiers who had conquered the world were becoming a landless proletariat with nothing to lose and everything to gain from supporting any politician who promised them relief. In 133 BC, a young aristocrat named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs. He proposed a radical solution to Rome's growing inequality: redistribute public land to landless citizens, breaking up the vast estates that had concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. The proposal was reasonable, legal, and desperately needed. It was also political dynamite. The wealthy landowners who dominated the Senate saw it as an attack on their fundamental interests. When Tiberius pushed his law through the popular assembly without Senate approval, he crossed a line that had held Roman politics together for centuries. On election day, as Tiberius sought re-election to continue his reforms, a mob of senators and their supporters attacked him and his followers with clubs and stones. Tiberius and 300 of his supporters were beaten to death and their bodies thrown into the Tiber River. It was the first time in Roman history that political disputes had been settled with violence in the streets of Rome itself. The precedent was set. When legal means failed, Romans would resort to force. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius, was elected tribune and tried to continue the reforms. He too was killed, along with 3,000 of his supporters. The Roman Republic was learning to eat its own children, but the greatest threat to the Republic came not from internal strife, but from the very armies that had made Rome master of the world. Roman legions were no longer citizen militias serving for a single campaign. They were professional soldiers who served for decades under the same commanders. These soldiers were loyal not to Rome, but to their generals. Their generals provided their pay, their plunder, their land grants upon retirement. In return, the soldiers would follow their commanders anywhere, even against Rome itself. The first general to test this new reality was Gaius Marius, a rough soldier from the Italian countryside who rose to prominence during the war against Jugurtha, a Numidian king who had been bribing Roman officials for years. Marius transformed the Roman army, creating the professional legions that would dominate the ancient world for the next 5 centuries. He standardized equipment, improved training, and most importantly, opened military service to the landless poor men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from. Following a successful general, Marius's new legions proved their worth when Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, invaded Gaul and threatened Italy itself. These weren't civilized enemies like the Greeks or Carthaginians. They were barbarian hordes, hundreds of thousands strong, who had already destroyed several Roman armies down at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae. Marius annihilated the Germanic invaders so completely that the threat to Italy was ended for generations. He was hailed as the savior of Rome, elected consul an unprecedented 6 times. But Marius's success created a new problem. What do you do with a general who becomes more powerful than the state itself? The answer came in the form of Lucius Cornelius Sylla, an aristocratic general who represented everything Marius opposed. When the social war broke out, a rebellion by Rome's Italian allies who demanded full citizenship, both Marius and Sulla commanded armies. When the war ended, both men claimed the right to lead a lucrative campaign against Mithridates, the king of Pontus who had massacred 80,000 Romans in Asia Minor. The dispute escalated until Marius seized Rome with his supporters and declared Sulla an enemy of the state. Sulla's response was unprecedented. He marched his legions on Rome itself. For the first time in Roman history, Roman soldiers entered the city in battle formation. Marius fled, and Sulla departed for his eastern campaign. But when Marius returned and seized Rome again, the cycle of violence escalated beyond anything the Republic had ever seen. Marius and his supporters compiled lists of enemies, proscription lists, and hunted them down in the streets. When Sulla returned victorious from the east, he found Rome controlled by his enemies. His response was swift and merciless. He defeated Marius's supporters in a series of battles, then implemented proscriptions that made Marius's purges look restrained. Sulla posted lists of names in the Forum: senators, knights, wealthy citizens who had opposed him or whose property he coveted. Anyone could kill a prescribed person and claim a reward. Sons were encouraged to murder fathers, slaves to betray masters, friends to denounce friends. For 3 years, Rome was ruled by terror. Thousands died, their property confiscated to reward Sulla's veterans. The Republic's institutions were twisted into instruments of personal vengeance. Then, in 79 BC, Sulla did something that shocked the Roman world. He voluntarily gave up power and retired to his villa in the countryside. He had proven that the Republic could be conquered, but he chose not to destroy it completely. Sulla's retirement gave Rome a breathing space, but the damage was done. The precedent was set. Roman armies could be used against Rome itself. Political disputes could be settled with proscription lists and mass murder. The Republic's institutions were no match for a determined general with loyal legions. And in the generation that followed Sulla's death, 3 men would emerge who would make Marius and Sulla look like amateurs in the art of destroying republics. Their names were Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. And their rivalry would bring down the Roman Republic forever. Picture Rome in the year 60 BC, the greatest city in the world. Home to over 1 million people, the beating heart of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. Marble temples gleamed on the 7 hills. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant mountains. The Forum bustled with merchants, lawyers, politicians, and philosophers from every corner of the Mediterranean. But beneath the grandeur, the Republic was rotting from within. The constitution that had served Rome for centuries was breaking down under the weight of empire. And 3 men were about to exploit that breakdown to seize power for themselves. They met in secret, away from the prying eyes of senators and the gossip of the Forum. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey, the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, Gaius, Julius Caesar, a charming aristocrat drowning in debt, but burning with ambition. On the surface, they had nothing in common. Pompey was Rome's greatest general, the man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East. Crassus was a businessman who had turned war and politics into profit. Caesar was a politician and priest who had never commanded an army in a major campaign. But they shared one crucial thing. They were all blocked by the Senate from achieving their goals. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted tax contracts for his business associates. Caesar wanted a consulship followed by a lucrative provincial command. So they made a deal. A secret alliance that would pool their resources and divide the Roman world among themselves. History would call it the First Triumvirate, the rule of 3 men. Caesar was elected consul for 59 BC, and he immediately began pushing through his partner's agenda. When his colleague Bibulus tried to oppose him, Caesar's supporters physically attacked the man, dumping a basket of dung over his head and breaking his ceremonial rods of office. Bibulus was so intimidated that he locked himself in his house for the rest of his term. Romans joked that it was the consulship of Julius and Caesar rather than Caesar and Bibulus. The violence was escalating. Roman politics had always been rough, but now it was becoming openly thuggish. Street gangs supported different politicians. Bribery was so common that interest rates spiked during election years as candidates borrowed money to buy votes. But Caesar's real prize came at the end of his consulship. Command of Gaul. Not just Cisalpine Gaul, the civilized part of northern Italy, but Transalpine Gaul as well. The wild lands beyond the Alps where Celtic tribes still practiced human sacrifice, and Roman merchants ventured at their own risk to most Romans. Gaul was a backwater assignment, a place to make money from taxes and maybe fight a few small wars against barbarian tribes. But Caesar saw something different, an opportunity to build an army, win glory, and accumulate the wealth and reputation he needed to challenge Pompey for supremacy in Rome. In 58 BC, Caesar crossed the Alps with 4 legions, about 24,000 men. When he returned 8 years later, He would have conquered territory larger than modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland combined. He would have led his armies across the Rhine into Germany and across the English Channel into Britain. He would have made himself the richest man in Rome and the most famous general since Alexander the Great. But first, he had to survive. Caesar's first challenge came from the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe that was migrating across Gaul with their entire population, nearly 400,000 people, including women, children, and elderly. They weren't invading Roman territory, just passing through. But Caesar saw an opportunity to establish his reputation. Asterisk at the Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's legions destroyed the Helvetian army and forced the survivors to return to their homeland. It was a brutal introduction to Roman efficiency, an entire people's migration, stopped by 4 legions and superior tactics. But the real test came when Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had been invited into Gaul by Celtic tribes, refused Caesar's order to withdraw back across the Rhine. The Germans were fierce warriors who had never been defeated by Romans. Caesar's own soldiers were terrified of fighting them. Caesar's response revealed the political genius that would make him master of Rome. He called his officers together and announced that, if necessary, he would advance with only the 10th Legion, his most loyal troops. The shame of being left behind while the 10th won glory was too much for the other legions to bear. They begged to be included in the campaign that Caesar crushed Ariovistus so completely that no Germanic tribe would cross the Rhine for generations. But his greatest victory was over his own men's fear. From that moment, Caesar's legions believed they were invincible, and that belief made them nearly so. Year after year, Caesar's conquests continued. The Belgae, the fiercest warriors in Gaul, were defeated in a series of brilliant campaigns. Celtic strongholds that had never fallen to foreign armies were stormed by Roman legions. Entire tribes were enslaved or exterminated. Caesar's engineers built bridges across rivers in 10 days. His legions marched faster and fought harder than any army in history. His dispatches to Rome, written in elegant Latin prose, made him a celebrity throughout the Mediterranean world. In 55 BC, Caesar did something that captured the Roman imagination like nothing before. He built a bridge across the Rhine and marched into Germany itself. For 18 days, Roman eagles flew over the mysterious forests beyond the great river. Then Caesar withdrew, having made his point. Rome could reach anywhere. That same year, Caesar crossed an even more mysterious barrier, the ocean itself. With 2 legions, he invaded Britain, the mystical island at the edge of the world. The landing was chaotic, the campaign brief, but the propaganda value was immense. Caesar had gone beyond the boundaries of the known world and returned with British hostages and tribute. But while Caesar was winning glory in Gaul, the triumvirate was falling apart in Rome. Crassus, jealous of his partner's military achievements, demanded his own command. Despite being 60 years old and having no experience with Eastern warfare, he insisted on leading an army against Parthia, the one great power that Rome had never defeated. The Parthian campaign was a disaster from the beginning. At Carrhae in 53 BC, Crassus and 7 legions were destroyed by Parthian horse archers. Crassus himself was killed, and according to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat to mock his famous greed. With Crassus dead, only Pompey and Caesar remained. And Rome, as the saying went, was not big enough for 2 such men. Pompey had spent the 50s consolidating his power in Rome while Caesar was conquering Gaul. He had been given extraordinary commands to deal with grain shortages and restore order to the eastern provinces. Gradually, he was becoming the unofficial ruler of the Roman world, but Caesar's Gallic victories were making him a rival that Pompey couldn't ignore. Caesar's wealth from Gallic plunder was legendary. His veterans were fanatically loyal. His reputation for clemency toward defeated enemies was winning him supporters throughout the Roman world. The crisis came in 52 BC when Gaul exploded in a final, desperate rebellion. Led by Vercingetorix, a young Gallic chieftain who united the tribes as never before. The Gauls came closer to destroying Caesar than any enemy he had ever faced. At Alesia, Vercingetorix made his final stand with 80,000 warriors in a hilltop fortress. Caesar surrounded the fortress with a wall, then built another wall facing outward when a Gallic relief army arrived. For weeks, Caesar's 8 legions held off attacks from both directions in one of the most famous sieges in military history. When Alesia finally fell, Vercingetorix surrendered himself to save his people from massacre. Caesar kept the Gallic leader as a prisoner for 6 years, then had him strangled during his triumph in Rome, a reminder of Roman mercy's limits. Gaul was conquered, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Caesar's own writings admit that over 1 million Gauls died in his campaigns, and another million were enslaved. Entire tribes disappeared from history. It was genocide on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. But in Rome, Caesar was hailed as a hero. His Gallic wars had made him the most famous man in the world and given him an army that would follow him anywhere. Now he wanted to return to Rome in triumph and claim his reward, a second consulship and the chance to rival Pompey for supreme power. Pompey and his allies in the Senate had other ideas. They demanded that Caesar disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for his illegal acts as consul. Caesar's response was to demand that Pompey do the same, give up his commands, and face the Roman people as equals. Negotiations continued through 50 BC, but both sides were preparing for war. Caesar moved his legions closer to Italy. Pompey recruited armies in the east. The Roman world held its breath, waiting to see which man would blink first. On January 7, 49 BC, the Senate passed its ultimate decree: let the consuls see to it that the Republic suffers no harm. It was a declaration of martial law, and it meant that Caesar was now officially an enemy of the Roman state. Caesar received the news at Ravenna, just south of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. According to Roman law, no general could bring armed forces across that river without Senate permission. To cross the Rubicon with his legions would be an act of war against the Republic itself. Caesar stood on the banks of the small river with a single legion, the 13th. His officers waited for his decision. Behind him lay 8 years of conquest and glory. Ahead lay either supreme power or death as a traitor. Caesar made his choice. As his soldiers watched, he stepped into the shallow water and spoke the words that would echo through history. Elia iacta est, the die is cast. The Roman Republic had less than 5 years to live. The Rubicon was just a small stream, barely knee-deep in winter. You could wade across it in minutes. But when Julius Caesar led the 13th Legion through those cold waters on January 10, 49 BC, he crossed more than a river. He crossed the line between Republic and Empire, between law and force, between the Rome that had been and the Rome that would be. The news reached Rome like a thunderbolt. Caesar was coming, and he was coming with an army. Panic seized the city. Senators fled their villas. Wealthy citizens buried their treasures. Pompey, the great general who was supposed to defend the Republic, made a decision that shocked everyone. He abandoned Rome without a fight. I have only to stamp my foot, Pompey had boasted, and legions will spring from the soil of Italy. But when Caesar's veterans began crossing the Rubicon, Pompey discovered that loyalty bought with gold was no match for loyalty earned through shared hardship and victory. Pompey's strategy was to withdraw to the east, where his clients and allies could provide him with unlimited resources. He would return to Italy with overwhelming force and crush Caesar like Sulla had crushed Marius. It was a sound plan if he had time to implement it, but Caesar moved with the speed that had made him master of Gaul. Town after town opened its gates to him. Italian communities that had suffered under Pompey's harsh rule welcomed Caesar as a liberator. Even Pompey's own legions began deserting to the man, who promised clemency instead of proscription. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, Caesar controlled all of Italy. He had won a civil war without fighting a single major battle. But his greatest victory was political, not military. He had shown mercy to his enemies. Unlike Marius and Sulla, Caesar didn't compile proscription lists. He didn't confiscate property or execute prisoners. Instead, he pardoned his opponents and invited them to join his cause. It was a calculated policy that he called clementia, clemency, and it would become his trademark. But clemency had its limits. When Caesar entered Rome, he found the treasury locked and the consul Metellus blocking his way. Caesar's response was swift and telling. "Young man, it is easier for me to kill you than to threaten you." Metellus stepped aside. Caesar needed money desperately. His legions expected pay, his supporters demanded rewards, and his enemies controlled most of the empire's wealth. The Roman treasury provided some relief, but Caesar knew he needed a decisive victory to secure his position. Pompey had fled to Greece with most of the Senate and was building a massive army. But Caesar couldn't afford to wait for Pompey to return. Instead, he made a characteristically bold decision. He would attack Pompey's supporters in Spain first, eliminating one threat before facing the main enemy. "I go to fight an army without a general," Caesar said of the Spanish campaign, "so that I may later fight a general without an army." At Ilerda, Caesar's tactical brilliance and his soldiers' engineering skills trapped Pompey's Spanish legions without a battle. When the enemy commanders surrendered, Caesar pardoned them all and incorporated their troops into his own army. But the real test was yet to come. In 48 BC, Caesar crossed the Adriatic with 7 legions to face Pompey directly. What followed was a campaign that would determine the fate of the Roman world. The early stages went badly for Caesar. Pompey controlled the seas, cutting off Caesar's supplies and reinforcements. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey outmaneuvered Caesar completely, inflicting the first major defeat of Caesar's career. Caesar's veterans, who had never known defeat, were shaken. But Pompey, cautious by nature, failed to follow up his advantage. Instead of destroying Caesar's weakened army, he withdrew to gather more forces. It was a fatal mistake that gave Caesar time to recover and regroup. The decisive moment came at Pharsalus in central Greece. Pompey commanded nearly twice as many men as Caesar, 47,000 against 25,000. His army included the best of the Roman nobility, experienced officers and troops from across the empire. On paper, Caesar should have been crushed out, but Caesar had advantages that couldn't be counted. Veterans who had conquered Gaul, officers who had learned their trade in 8 years of constant warfare, and most importantly, absolute confidence in their commander's genius. On the morning of August 9th, 48 BC, the two armies faced each other across the plain of Pharsalus. Caesar rode along his lines, reminding his soldiers that they faced fellow Romans, not barbarians. "Spare the citizens," he commanded. This would be a battle for Rome's future, not its destruction. Pompey's plan was to use his superior cavalry to outflank Caesar's right wing, then roll up the entire line. It was a sound strategy that should have worked. But Caesar had prepared a surprise, a fourth line of his best troops, hidden behind his cavalry. Armed with javelins and trained to target the faces of Pompey's horsemen, when Pompey's cavalry charged, Caesar's hidden troops emerged and drove them from the field. Then they wheeled around and attacked Pompey's main line from behind. Caught between Caesar's advancing legions and his flanking force, Pompey's army disintegrated in less than 4 hours. The fate of the Roman world was decided. Pompey fled the battlefield, his dreams of glory shattered. The Republic's last great defender had been defeated by the man who would destroy it. Caesar's victory was complete, but the cost was terrible. 6,000 Romans lay dead on the field of Pharsalus, citizens who should have been fighting barbarians together, not killing each other in civil war. Caesar wept as he walked among the bodies, reportedly saying, "They would have it so." Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, whom he had helped place on the throne. But the Egyptians, calculating that Caesar would be the winner, decided to eliminate Pompey before Caesar arrived. As Pompey's boat approached the Egyptian shore, he was stabbed to death by men he had considered friends. His head was cut off and presented to Caesar when the victor arrived in Alexandria. Caesar reportedly wept at the sight, whether from genuine grief or political theater. We'll never know. Pompey the Great, who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East, died on a foreign beach, murdered by men seeking to curry favor with his enemy. It was an ignoble end for a man who had once been the most powerful person in the world. But Caesar's Egyptian adventure was just beginning. In Alexandria, he met Cleopatra VII, the brilliant and beautiful queen who would become his lover and the mother of his son. Their affair was political as much as personal. Caesar needed Egyptian wealth to fund his wars, and Cleopatra needed Roman protection to secure her throne. For months, Caesar lingered in Egypt, seemingly forgetting that he had enemies throughout the empire who were regrouping for new attacks. His officers grew restless, his soldiers grumbled, and his enemies took heart from his apparent infatuation with an exotic queen. The wake-up call came from Asia Minor, where Pharnacus, son of the great Mithridates, had invaded Roman territory while Caesar was distracted. Caesar marched north with a small force and crushed the Pontic army so quickly that he sent his famous dispatch to Rome. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But more serious threats remained. In North Africa, Pompey's supporters had allied with King Juba of Numidia and were building a new army. In Spain, Pompey's sons were raising the standard of rebellion. Caesar would spend 2 more years hunting down the last defenders of the Republic. The African campaign culminated at Thapsus, where Caesar's elephants, turned back by his soldiers' war cries, trampled their own army. Cato the Younger, the Republic's most principled defender, chose suicide rather than accept Caesar's pardon, stabbing himself in the stomach and pulling out his own entrails when his friends tried to save him. Cato's death was a propaganda disaster for Caesar. Here was a man so committed to republican principles that he preferred death to life under a dictator. Caesar reportedly said that he envied Cato his death because Cato had denied Caesar the glory of pardoning him. The final campaign was in Spain, where Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus had raised 13 legions. At Munda in 45 BC, Caesar fought the hardest battle of his career. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Caesar himself had to grab a shield and fight in the front ranks to rally his wavering troops. When victory finally came, it was complete. Gnaeus Pompey was killed, Sextus fled to become a pirate, and the last Republican army was destroyed. After 4 years of civil war, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Caesar returned to Rome for a series of triumphs that dazzled the world. For days, the spoils of Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa paraded through the streets. Vercingetorix was strangled in the traditional manner. Cleopatra, pregnant with Caesar's son, watched from a golden throne as her lover celebrated his victories. But Caesar's greatest triumph was political. He had been appointed dictator for life, with powers that made him king in all but name. He controlled the armies, appointed the magistrates, and commanded the loyalty of the people through his lavish games and generous distributions of grain and money. Yet even at the height of his power, Caesar was making enemies. His clemency had spared many Republicans, but it hadn't converted them. His reforms: citizenship for Gauls, land for veterans, public works for the unemployed, threatened traditional Roman values. And his relationship with Cleopatra suggested that he might be planning to establish a dynasty, most dangerous of all, Caesar seemed to be reaching for divine honors. He allowed temples to be built in his honor, accepted a golden throne in the Senate House, and appeared in public wearing the purple robes and laurel crown of a triumphant general. To many Romans, he was beginning to look less like a Roman magistrate and more like an Eastern king in the shadows of the Senate House. A conspiracy was forming. Led by Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the Brutus who had expelled the last king, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, 60 senators swore an oath to restore the Republic by killing the man who had destroyed it. They called themselves the Liberators, and they believed that Caesar's death would automatically restore republican government. It was a naive belief that would cost them everything. But they were desperate men driven by principle and hatred in equal measure. The date they chose was March 15, 44 B.C., the Ides of March. Caesar had been warned by soothsayers to beware that day, but he dismissed such superstitions. He was planning to leave Rome soon for a campaign against Parthia, and there were important matters to settle in the Senate first. As Caesar entered the Senate House that morning, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. When he sat down to read it, they struck 20-3 wounds. That's how many times they stabbed him. Caesar fought back at first, but when he saw Brutus among his attackers, Brutus, whom he had treated like a son, he reportedly said, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" and stopped resisting. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, destroyer of the Republic, master of the Roman world, died at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on the Senate floor. The liberators had achieved their goal, but as Caesar's body lay bleeding in the Senate House, the conspirators made a fatal discovery. Killing a tyrant is easy, but restoring a republic is almost impossible. They had eliminated Caesar, but they had no plan for what came next. Within hours, Caesar's supporters were rallying. His lieutenant Mark Antony seized Caesar's papers and treasury. His great-nephew Octavian, named as Caesar's heir, was racing toward Rome with an army. The people of Rome, who had loved Caesar for his generosity, were calling for vengeance. The liberators had killed Caesar, but they had not killed Caesarism. The republic they thought they were saving was already dead. Murdered not by Caesar's ambition, but by its own inability to govern an empire. And from the ashes of the republic, something new was about to be born. Something that would last for 1,500 years and shape the destiny of the Western world. The Roman Empire was coming. Rome. March 15, 44 BC. The greatest man in the world lay dead on the Senate floor, his blood seeping between the marble stones where Roman senators had debated for centuries. The liberators stood over Caesar's body, their daggers dripping. Convinced they had saved the Republic, they were wrong. Within hours of Caesar's assassination, it became clear that the conspirators had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had killed the man, but not the system that had made him possible. Caesar's veterans still controlled the legions. His supporters still held key positions throughout the empire. And most importantly, Caesar had an heir. Gaius Octavius was just 18 years old when he received the news of his great-uncle's death. He was studying in Greece, preparing for Caesar's planned Parthian campaign, when messengers brought word that Caesar had named him as his adopted son and principal heir. Most people expected the teenager to flee to safety, or accept a quiet life of luxury. Instead, Octavian, as he now called himself, taking Caesar's name, made a decision that would change history. He would claim his inheritance and avenge his adoptive father's murder. But first, he had to survive. Rome in 44 BC was a powder keg waiting to explode. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, controlled the consul's office and Caesar's papers. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus commanded Caesar's cavalry and held the loyalty of many veterans. The liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, were trying to rally Republican sentiment. And into this chaos walked a teenager with no military experience. Number political base, and no apparent qualifications except a famous name and an enormous inheritance. The established players dismissed him as irrelevant. They underestimated him completely. Octavian's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. He used Caesar's wealth to pay the legacies that Caesar had promised to the Roman people, 300 sestertii to every citizen. When Antony tried to block the payments, Octavian paid them from his own pocket, borrowing money at ruinous interest rates to honor his father's promises. The effect was electric. To the Roman people, Octavian wasn't just Caesar's heir. He was Caesar's avenger and the guardian of Caesar's generosity. Crowds began following him through the streets, chanting his name and demanding justice for Caesar's murder. But Octavian knew that popular support alone wouldn't be enough. He needed military power, and that meant winning over Caesar's veterans. These were hard men who had conquered Gaul and fought in the civil wars. They had no reason to follow an untested teenager, except that Octavian was Caesar's son, and Caesar had been like a god to his soldiers. When Octavian appeared at their camps, wearing Caesar's signet ring and speaking of vengeance, the veterans saw not a boy, but the living embodiment of their beloved commander. 2 of Caesar's legions defected to Octavian, bringing with them their eagles, their standards, and their unshakable loyalty to Caesar's memory. Suddenly, the teenager had an army. The Senate, led by the great orator Cicero, saw an opportunity to use Octavian against Antony. They granted the young man extraordinary honors, a seat in the Senate, the rank of praetor, and command of his legions. Cicero famously said that Octavian should be praised, honored, and eliminated. It was Cicero who would be eliminated. The war between Antony and the Senate's forces culminated at Mutina in northern Italy. Octavian fought alongside the consuls against Antony, helping to win a victory that drove Caesar's former lieutenant into exile. But both consuls died in the battle, leaving Octavian as the only commander with an intact army. Now, Octavian revealed the political genius that would make him master of the world. Instead of pursuing Antony as the Senate expected, he marched on Rome and demanded the consulship. When the Senate refused, pointing out that he was only 19 and hadn't held any of the required lower offices, Octavian's response was simple and devastating. "These," he said, pointing to his legions, "will give me the consulship." For the second time in 5 years, Roman soldiers marched through the streets of Rome in battle formation. The Senate capitulated immediately, electing Octavian consul and granting him the power to prosecute Caesar's assassins. But Octavian's greatest masterstroke was yet to come. Instead of continuing to fight Antony, he opened secret negotiations with his enemy. And when Lepidus joined the talks, the 3 men reached an agreement that would reshape the Roman world. They met on a small island at a river near Bologna. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. For 3 days, they negotiated the division of the Roman Empire among themselves. When they emerged, they had formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship that gave them absolute power for 5 years. But first, they had to eliminate their enemies. Unlike Caesar, who had shown clemency to his opponents, the triumvirs decided to use the weapon that Sulla had perfected. Proscription. They compiled lists of 300 senators and 2,000 knights who were declared enemies of the state. Anyone could kill a proscribed person and claim a reward. Property was confiscated, families destroyed, friendships shattered. The most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator who had opposed Antony with his brilliant speeches. When Antony's soldiers caught up with the old man, they cut off his head and hands, the head that had spoken against tyranny, the hands that had written in defense of the Republic. Antony's wife, Fulvia, reportedly pulled out Cicero's tongue and stabbed it repeatedly with her hairpin, taking revenge for all the speeches that had attacked her husband. It was a fitting symbol of what was happening to Roman civilization: eloquence murdered by brutality, law replaced by force, with their enemies dead or fled. The triumvirs turned their attention to the liberators. Brutus and Cassius had fled to the east, where they were building armies and claiming to represent the legitimate republic. The final battle for Caesar's legacy would be fought on the plains of Philippi in Macedonia. The Battle of Philippi was really two battles, fought 3 weeks apart in 42 BC in the first engagement. Brutus defeated Octavian's forces while Antony crushed Cassius. Cassius, thinking all was lost, committed suicide on the same dagger he had used to kill Caesar. The second battle was decisive. Brutus's army, demoralized by Cassius's death, and facing the combined forces of Antony and Octavian, was utterly destroyed. Brutus himself fell on his sword, reportedly saying, "Virtue, I have followed you as a reality, but you were only a word." The Republic was dead. The last men who had believed in it lay scattered on a foreign battlefield, their dreams of restored liberty buried with their bodies. The triumvirs divided the Roman world among themselves. Antony took the wealthy East with its ancient kingdoms and lucrative trade routes. Lepidus received Africa, rich but remote. Octavian got the West Italy Gaul, and Spain, which seemed like the worst share, but would prove to be the foundation of ultimate victory. While Antony pursued glory and pleasure in the East, Octavian focused on the unglamorous work of governing. He settled Caesar's veterans on confiscated land, rebuilt Italian cities damaged by civil war, and slowly but systematically built a power base that extended throughout the Western Empire. Meanwhile, Antony was falling under the spell of Cleopatra, the brilliant Egyptian queen who had once been Caesar's lover. Their affair was passionate and political. Antony needed Egyptian wealth for his planned conquest of Parthia, while Cleopatra sought to restore Egypt's ancient empire under Roman protection. But to Romans, the relationship looked like betrayal. Antony was abandoning Roman values for Eastern luxury, Roman law for Egyptian despotism. When he married Cleopatra in an Egyptian ceremony and acknowledged their children as his heirs, he gave Octavian the propaganda weapon that would destroy him. Antony's Parthian campaign was a disaster that cost him 24,000 men and enormous prestige. His subsequent wars in Armenia brought some success but couldn't restore his reputation. Meanwhile, Octavian was methodically eliminating Lepidus and consolidating control over the Western Empire. The final confrontation was inevitable. In 32 BC, Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, cleverly framing the conflict as a war between Rome and a foreign queen rather than another civil war between Romans. The decisive battle came at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, on September 2, 31 BC. It was primarily a naval engagement, with Antony and Cleopatra commanding a fleet of massive warships against Octavian's smaller but more maneuverable vessels. The battle was hard fought and could have gone either way until Cleopatra suddenly withdrew her Egyptian squadron and fled toward Egypt. Antony, seeing his lover's ships departing, abandoned his own fleet and followed her, leaving his remaining forces to surrender to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where they spent their last months in desperate revelry, knowing that Octavian was coming with an unstoppable army. When the end came, they chose death over capture. Antony fell on his sword, while Cleopatra allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, dying as dramatically as she had lived. With Antony and Cleopatra dead, Octavian stood alone as master of the Roman world. At 32 years old, he controlled an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. He commanded more than 50 legions and had access to wealth beyond imagination. But Octavian had learned from Caesar's mistake. He would not appear to be a king or dictator. Instead, he would restore the Republic, or at least the appearance of it, while keeping real power in his own hands. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before the Senate and made a stunning announcement. He was resigning all his extraordinary powers and returning the state to the Senate and people of Rome. The Republic was restored. Of course, it was all theater. The Senate, packed with Octavian's supporters and terrified of a return to civil war, immediately begged him to reconsider. They granted him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one, and gave him powers that made him emperor in all but name. Augustus, as we must now call him, had achieved something that no Roman before him had managed. He had ended the civil wars without appearing to destroy the Republic. He was not a king or dictator, but the first citizen princeps of a restored constitutional government. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had begun. For the first time in a century, the Mediterranean world was at peace. Trade flourished, cities grew, art and literature experienced a golden age. Augustus rebuilt Rome with marble temples and monuments that proclaimed the glory of his reign. But Augustus's greatest achievement was not military or architectural, it was administrative. He created a system of government that could function efficiently across vast distances and diverse cultures. Professional civil servants replaced corrupt governors. Standing armies secured the frontiers. A postal system connected the remotest provinces to Rome. Augustus ruled for 45 years, longer than any Roman leader before or after. When he died in 14 AD, he left behind an empire that was stable, prosperous, and seemingly eternal. His last words were reportedly, "I found Rome brick and left it marble." But perhaps more importantly, he had found Rome tearing itself apart in civil war and left it united under a system that would endure for centuries. The Roman Republic was dead, but from its ashes had risen something greater. The Roman Empire, and that empire was just beginning. Its march through history, 2,000 years have passed since Augustus breathed. His last breath in that villa outside Rome, the empire he founded would endure for another 15 centuries in the East, finally falling when Constantinople was conquered by the Turks in 1453 AD. But even then, Rome's influence didn't die, it transformed. Today, as you walk through any major city in the Western world, you walk through Rome's shadow. The dome of the U.S. Capitol echoes the Pantheon. The legal systems of dozens of nations trace their roots to Roman law. The languages of 500 million people, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are Latin's children. The very words we use to describe government come from Rome: republic, senate, citizen, constitution. When we speak of justice, we invoke Roman principles. When we build roads, aqueducts, or sewers, we follow Roman engineering. When we organize armies, we use Roman tactics and Roman ranks. But Rome's greatest legacy isn't architectural or legal. It's the idea that diverse peoples can be united under common laws, that citizenship can transcend ethnicity, that civilization can be built on merit rather than birth. These were revolutionary concepts in the ancient world, and they remain the foundation of modern democracy. Rome showed us that empires rise and fall, but ideas endure. That power without justice is tyranny, but justice without power is impotence. That the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that republics die not from external conquest, but from internal corruption. Today, you can walk through the Roman Forum and see the stones where Caesar bled, where Cicero spoke, where senators debated the fate of the known world. The voices are silent now, the crowds have gone home, but the echoes remain. For Rome was more than an empire, it was an idea. The idea that human beings can govern themselves, that law can triumph over force, that civilization can endure even when civilizations fall. And as long as people dream of justice, of order, of a world united in peace and prosperity, Rome will never truly die, for we are all Romans now.